of Scotland, where we could see some damaging gusts of wind to come through the day. And it remains windy through much of the day. Even further south, the winds will start to pick up, staying quite cloudy across the far south of the UK, but elsewhere brightening skies, a few showers pushing their way through, and cooler weather with the blustery conditions. Now, the worst of the winds will ease through Saturday evening, pulling out into the North Sea. With that ridge of high pressure building in, then we'll see the skies clearing, the winds easing down, and a touch of frost is likely as we start the day on Sunday. Temperatures in rural spots getting close to freezing. But you can already see out towards the west this next system starting to push its way in. That'll start to increase the cloud across the sky, so a hazy sunny start, but quickly turning quite cloudy. And I think as we get into the afternoon on Sunday, we will see that wet weather pushing in across Scotland. Notice it bumping into the colder air, could give some hill snow as well. And later on, we will see those winds turn very strong once again, where warnings remain in place for Sunday. We'll keep you updated with the latest. Bye-bye.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world. If
you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. Well, over a drink, we have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Good evening, I'm Alastair Stewart. Coming up on the programme, in Liz we trust. The Foreign Secretary comes under more fire for her flying choices. But is the criticism warranted? The row over a planned rise in national insurance and the battle lines that are party political for the Tories. Have some of our universities lost the plot on literature? Harry Potter is slapped with a trigger warning so as not to offend adult students. All that coming up, but first, a news update with Karen Roberts.
Thank you, Alastair. Your update from the GB newsroom. The Met Police says it's received the material requested from the Cabinet Office as part of the investigation into alleged Downing Street lockdown breaches. Scotland Yard are under fire after asking that minimal reference be made to events at Number 10 in Sue Gray's official report. The force says it's to avoid prejudice to their inquiries, but confirmed the investigation hasn't been escalated to a criminal one. Critics say a swift publication of Miss Gray's report in full is in the public interest. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says it's becoming too much of a distraction.
Got a criminal investigation into the behaviour of the Prime Minister and what went on in Downing Street. There are bound to be process issues along the way, but this is caused by one thing, and that's the behaviour of the Prime Minister.
The Russian president has told his French counterpart that Moscow's main security concerns over Ukraine have not been addressed. Vladimir Putin held talks with Emmanuel Macron earlier, following the US and NATO's response to Russia's proposals. They include a request that Ukraine will never be allowed to join the group. It's as the Kremlin sent its strongest signal yet that it's willing to engage with the US and reiterated it doesn't want a war. Speaking earlier, US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says there is no reason the situation has to dissolve into conflict.
Conflict is not inevitable. There is still time and space for diplomacy. The United States, in lockstep with our allies and partners, has offered Russia a path away from crisis and toward greater security.
Meanwhile, British companies are being warned to strengthen their digital defences following malicious online attacks in Ukraine. The National Cybersecurity Centre says the incidents bear the hallmarks of Russian activity. No current threats have been identified in the UK, but guidance has been updated to ensure businesses stay ahead of potential threats. 7 men have been jailed for a combined total of 60 years for multiple firearms offences. Metropolitan Police recovered several weapons in the operation against the Essex-based organised criminal gang. The men were sentenced at Southwark Crown Court after being found guilty of supplying illegal guns and ammunition to criminals in the South East. The government's pledging to officially recognise British Sign Language. It's after a new bill had an unopposed second reading in the Commons. Campaigners hope the legislation will improve access for deaf people and promote signing during public announcements. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Alastair Stewart.
Thanks, Karen. Last night, the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, came under fire. Not because Russia continues to mass its forces on Ukraine's borders, Chinese military aircraft continue to buzz Taiwan, the people of Afghanistan are starving. Oh, and here the Northern Ireland Brexit protocol is on the point of collapse. No. She was savaged for flying to Australia on a government-leased aircraft rather than a commercial flight. It was described as a private jet, implying that it had been rented for a one-off flight and that the trip was said to have cost £500,000. Now, I may be odd, but the words United Kingdom all along the fuselage and the Union Jack emblazoned on the tail fin might just have hinted that it wasn't a private jet, but a government asset. It is on a long lease from a charter company, and how anyone got to £500,000 is literally beyond me. But facts often get in the way of a good story, don't they? And given the government faces no other problems, no Partygate, no investigations, no row over taxation and COVID restrictions and a whole lot more, well, I guess someone somewhere needed a story. By way of background, it was actually David Cameron who embarked on the policy of leased aircraft and/or converted refuelling tankers for the use of senior ministers and the royal family, saying it would save about £750,000 a year compared with chartering flights. Long-haul charters cost on average £6,700 per flying hour, whilst using the Voyager aircraft costs around £2,000. And that's according to the Ministry of Defence. But despite all of that, Ms Truss was pressed on her trip, and she said, "I use the government plane. That's why we have government planes, to enable government ministers to conduct government business. And that's why I flew to Australia. Every government decision is based on value for money. We have a government plane specifically so that ministers like me, in my role as Foreign Secretary, can go and do the work overseas, which is ultimately delivering for the British people." Close quotes. The Foreign Office said the trip was within the rules set by the Ministerial Code. A spokesman added, using the private jet allowed the trip's delegation to travel together and have private discussions on sensitive security matters, that commercial flights were fully booked, and that using a commercial flight would have separated Ms Truss from her delegation and her protection team. It also gave Ms Truss the option of returning to the United Kingdom early, if needs be, for a crisis in Northern Ireland, or in the Ukraine, or anywhere else. It's pointed out that Defence Secretary Ben Wallace was also at those Australia talks. But I'll bet a tin helmet and an anti-tank weapon that if things suddenly hit the fan in Ukraine, he wouldn't have been seeking a seat on the next scheduled flight. He'd have been on the flexible flight offered by Ms Truss's jet, quicker than you could say scramble. The talks, incidentally, were about trade, regional security and several other issues. Australia's an important ally under the Chinese threat. It's also an increasingly important trade partner post-Brexit. Mere details, I'm sure, but there they are. It is a storm in a teacup. You know, the Americans don't go bonkers when the president flies around the world in one of his fleet of mighty Boeings, accompanied by all of those big beast cars and other accompanying motorcade vehicles. Germany has just ordered more aircraft to add to its ministerial squadron. Oh, and the French fleet comes in 3 or 4 different sizes. They all do it because it makes financial sense, offers flexibility, and guarantees security. So, if folk want to have a go, get the facts right and think it through. I also want the UK and its government, our nation, our government, to look good abroad. It's part of the brand. I want ministers to be fleet of foot when abroad at a time of crisis, not twiddling their fingers for the next scheduled flight that might have a free seat from wherever they are to wherever they need to be. I want their top teams, their advisors, their security people to be with them all the time. I also quite like the idea that there's room there too for the press to accompany senior ministers on such trips, as long as they pay their way. Finally, by all means take a pop at ministers who screw up, at a government under real pressure for glad-handing gatherings whilst others suffered, for promising much but delivering little on some of the big issues of the day. But let's not bore our viewers, listeners or readers over common-sense decisions that actually end up saving you, dear taxpayer, and me, a bit of money. And I'm joined now by Culver Ranger, a communications and strategy consultant, a former aide to Boris Johnson when he was mayor, and a bit of an expert on transport. Now, good to see you. You were more buses and tubes when you were in that neck of the woods, but can you see why some people have cut up rough about Liz Truss and that jet?
I really am surprised at the scrutiny this has got, but it just goes to show, Alastair, that the day and age that we live in terms of what stories the media think will get traction, because obviously there's an editorial decision that says we think putting out a story about the Foreign Secretary taking the government plane is going to get traction. And maybe it does. Maybe that's what feeds the social media machine. But the problem we found with social media and this kind of news is that, I think, as you were saying quite rightly in your monologue, it doesn't present the facts. It doesn't even go to present the whole picture. And this is where we stumble into the position of almost fake news. Is this really news? Are we being given a complete story? And can we trust the media sources or even the social media channels that we're receiving this information from? And that's the big worry for me from this.
Yeah, and the answer to that one is no, evidently, and thank you for that observation. And I tell you the other thing that worries me, from a communications point of view, and you and I, when I used to do the London programme, we had a lot of dealings about, what the mayor actually meant by doing so and so, and what lay behind it and what have you. Some on the record, some off the record. We all know how it works. But if the Foreign Secretary has to waste time explaining why she's going on that aircraft rather than that one, as opposed to explaining why she thinks there's an upside to the trade deal for farmers who don't think there is, that's a complete waste of vital time as well.
You're absolutely right, because actually the audience would probably be interested to understand in more detail what the Foreign Secretary was doing there, the value that she was getting for brand Britain, as you were putting it, but also for us as constituents. What was the detail of policies discussed? And we could scrutinise the genuine story. The problem we have is that the Foreign Secretary feels now that she has to answer these questions, because if she doesn't, then that can cast even more aspersion or even run the story, because she's choosing not to recognise the question. And I feel politicians, we all know, we have little sympathy for them most of the time, but really at the moment they're caught between a rock and a hard place, because if they don't answer every single question that's posed to them, they're considered to be avoiding the question, even if it's to the degree of completely misleading the public in terms of not giving them the full story of what they're actually doing there.
Yeah. I tell you one thing, and I'd love to hear your view, and you're a former Tory candidate as well of all of those other things that I said in the introduction, and I should have mentioned it because it's important to folk listening to what you've been saying and what you're about to say. I have a slight worry that despite all of the other stuff that's going on, a government that has a majority still in the top 70s, it was elected with one of 80, but it's still round about 77 or so, have they collectively got a bit complacent in terms of how they explain what they're doing? And I don't want her to tell me why she chose that plane. I want more genuine information of why policy X is happening and why policy Y is being delayed. Big majority, complacent government.
I think governments can become complacent, and I'll say this, and probably not because of all my Tory credentials, as you're quite rightly I do have. This government has had to deal with this global pandemic, and it seems, obvious to say, but it has completely shifted the entire priority that the government came in with around what policy agenda it was trying to deliver. And it's had to deal with that quite rightly. It's trying to now get back on track or bring forward more of its policies, because we seem to be now getting at least a bit of a grip of where COVID is, and hopefully much better state for the country and the economy. But levelling up, dealing with adult social care, dealing with the issues of the cost of living, dealing with inflation, which is a consequence of some of the COVID issues that we've seen as well. These are the big policy areas for this government, and I think they actually do want the debate on this question. Now, you could say I'm making a political point, but Her Majesty's opposition should actually be challenging the government on these things and could probably make some really good traction on some of this stuff. But they are choosing, whether rightly or wrongly, because the public do have an interest in some of the things that we've been hearing about parties and various other things, but they're spending all of their political time holding the government accountable on those issues. Are they really tackling the government on delivery of the policies from their election manifesto, or how those policies are going forward now? I think the biggest thing a government could do, whichever government, was try to deal with the issue of funding adult social care for the long term. Yes. We all have a part in that issue, whatever age we are. It's something that affects every single person in this country. Absolutely. And then the second thing, which is equally large, is levelling up, or rather, how do we get all parts of our country to be successful with investment, with jobs, with future for young people, and not that they feel they have to always travel to the big cities or come down to London or whatever it is. Two magnificent policy agendas that could deserve huge amount of effort and scrutiny, and I think that's where the focus is and should be.
On the first one, I particularly agree with you, and we'll be talking about it later on in the programme tonight, because the social care element of the national insurance thing is a complete con for the first period. It will all go to National Health Service. It will not go to folk who are in care. But that's not an argument I want to have to you. Final question to you. Are you expecting a call from the Prime Minister yourself to return to his side if, as everybody is saying, whatever happens from Sue Gray and the Met, there's likely to be a big shake-up at Number 10 to get those communications sorted out? Are you expecting the call? And if you got it, would you go?
No, I don't know. The Prime Minister and I are friends. I've known him a very long time. I would always take a call from the Prime Minister. He's the Prime Minister of my country. I'd be honoured to speak to him. If he asks for my help, I'd gladly give it. But at the moment, I do have my hands full with plenty of work and 2 young children, which I'm very fond of seeing a lot of. Because let's be honest, I said those jobs are extremely demanding. I've been in City Hall. I know what it's like. I can't imagine the intensity of the pressure in 10 Downing Street.
I've seen you in City Hall and I know exactly what you mean. Good luck with the young one. As a new granddad, I speak from the heart. It is the most wonderful thing in the world. Kulvig, always great to see you. Look after yourself and come and see us anytime. You're most welcome. Thank you so much. Culver Ranger, their former aide to the Prime Minister in the London Mayor days. After the break, what's going on with Sue Gray's report? We'll speak to a leading lawyer to discuss why we've still not seen it.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world. If
you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Welcome back. For a top-level inquiry designed to lance the festering boil of Partygate, Sue Gray's is rapidly turning into a farce. It was commissioned in sombre and sober terms to clarify who did what, where and when, and subsequently who said what to whom and where about it all. All good. Then Ms Gray showed her first draft to the Met. And on Tuesday, the Met Commissioner Cressida Dick said she too was launching an investigation in what appeared to be, and I quote, serious and flagrant breaches of the law, close quotes. Well, for a couple of days, it wasn't clear whether Ms Gray would still publish or not, as a frenzy of unfolded stories crossed back and forth Whitehall, with lawyers, HR people and all the rest of them. Well, today the Met have formally asked Ms Gray, or whoever publishes her magnus opus, to make only minimal references to the parties it is investigating, to avoid prejudicing whatever happens after they've completed their investigation. Limbo. Or, for all involved, purgatory. So, what legally is going on? And I'm delighted to be joined now by criminal defence lawyer Simon Nichols. Simon, before we go any further, I should share with the folk at home and indeed with you that it's now being widely reported that Ms Gray will publish, despite what Cressida Dick had to say earlier on today. We don't know the detail of whatever's been sorted out, but that's just the breaking news I wanted you to be aware of and folk at home. Now, I don't want to get into an argument with you about the politics of it, and I think we explained to you we just wanted a clear-cut legal explanation. What are the pitfalls that the Met are seeking to avoid?
A criminal lawyer arguing? I don't think we'd ever do that.
Well, let's not get into the politics. Let's stick with the law. The Met have got some very good lawyers working with them. Yeah, go on.
You've been around a long time. When you were a young journalist, you'll remember how careful you had to be when reporting anything. Newspapers, the old-fashioned TV media. You couldn't report very little. If someone was arrested, it would merely a man has been arrested or a woman has been arrested. And over the years, we've seen that erosion of that element of anonymity. And the problem is that the Metropolitan Police are going to be concerned that too much being released too soon could possibly prejudice the inquiry. And that's a general principle that works for a criminal investigation. Now, the one distinction I would draw here is that we're talking about breach of COVID requirements. We're not talking about an international conspiracy. We're not talking about a major drug dealing ring. We're talking about some fixed penalty fines for people who are associating with other people allegedly in a party situation. And one has to ask the question, really, is a civil service report going to prejudice that sort of inquiry? And I think that's the acid test.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it started before the police got involved.
Yeah. Let me pick up on that first point, because it's utterly vital, and you're quite right about the youthful days of standing outside courts with your little notepad and paper. And the key thing about not giving detail, names or anything like that, was prejudicial to a jury trial, identifying somebody who may be subsequently acquitted by his or her peers. This isn't going to the jury. At worst, it's going to go to a magistrate, isn't it?
Logically, the worst it would do is go to a magistrate's court. I suspect people might want to judicially review decision-making, all that sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, we're talking about fixed penalty fines. And there is, without stepping on any political argument, a question about the resource that's being used to investigate this matter by the most senior police force in the country, when one could argue there are plenty of other things they could be investigating rather than some historical fixed penalty fines.
They've also got into difficulties over that very point, and it is, I'm glad you pointed out, a legal point, not a political point. And they've said both things, that they don't look at historic cases, and then lo and behold, then they do look at some historic cases. That's legal. Is that DPP-type people, Director of Public Prosecutions, advising them, or is it their own internal lawyers advising them?
My guess, and it's no more than an educated guess based on defending people for 40-odd years, is I suspect this is an internal legal advice rather than the CPS. I may be completely wrong, but my guess is this is internal lawyer advice, because the police have their own lawyers as well as, of course, the independent Crown Prosecution Service. Yeah.
You also mentioned, almost in passing a moment ago, vital couple of words, judicial review. If, and it's purely speculative, a civil servant working in Downing Street, even quite a senior one, was dismissed the service for whatever Ms Gray or the Met find out, they might have a case, might they not, under judicial review of that decision to say, well, hang on a minute, it was a senior civil servant working in the Cabinet Office who was appointed to look into what I had or had not been up to. Police intervened, did this, that and the other. Whatever it was not done well.
You have identified a potential, if you like, a triage of possibilities. We've got the civil service report, we've got the possibility of criminal prosecution, but we've also got, of course, employment issues, because civil servants will have employment rights. And of course, one has to be incredibly careful that their employment rights are not prejudiced or in any way affected by way of either the investigation or the police investigation. So it's a lawyer's Christmas hamper of all different sort of possibilities here.
It'll be fascinating. Just one very silly point before I leave you. That's not a guillotine over your left shoulder, is it?
Do you know what? If you remember House of Cards and Kevin Spacey's rowing machine, it's one of those.
I'm mighty relieved. Simon, great to talk to you. Thank you for your objective, impartial guidance through the legal quagmire of it all. Good to talk to you. Simon Nichols there, defence barrister. After the break, Russia versus the West. We have analysis as the developments continue, even as we're speaking. Stay with us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world. If
you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Welcome back. Washington is warning Russia could be just weeks away from a full-scale traditional invasion of Ukraine. That, as Russia's President Putin tells French President Macron, the West has ignored Russian concerns over NATO for far too long. He is, however, prepared to hold off for now. And that, as Russia's 100,000-strong army along its border with Ukraine and on the territory of its ally Belarus continues to build. Some analysts say they are just a few battalions short of a slam-dunk force, but it's getting close. Jets and warships are too being pressed into action under cover of manoeuvres and exercises. It's all very 20th century predictable stuff. Meantime, some rather more 21st century stuff is also underway. As President Biden says he's still offering the Russians a diplomatic route out, there are fresh warnings today from NATO that Russia's already up to its cyber tricks, and there's more to come. What's more, Washington has also thrown the gas pipeline Nord Stream 2 into play. If Russia attacks, the US will block it. That in itself is quite interesting, as Germany is actually the key player, but I guess it tells you all you need to know about NATO. Meantime, from leaders to secretaries of state, that should be state leaders to secretaries of state, mind games are also being played aplenty. So, could it be fought and won or fought and lost without a bullet even being fired? Joining me is Rear Admiral Chris Parry, former Director Operational Capability in the Ministry of Defence, Commander of the Amphibious Task Group and Director General Develop Concepts and Doctrine. It's a long old lead-in, Chris, but it all fits. You've been there and you've done the ordinary stuff, but you've also sat and thought deeply about where we're going and how we might be developing warfare. I'm going to come to that towards the end of the conversation, but let me ask you, first of all, how close, in your view, are Russia to going in to do what they have talked about doing?
They're not close at all. I don't think Russia is going to invade at all. This is a very complex game of poker, and the stakes are being raised on both sides, and sooner or later somebody is going to be asked to show their cards. I don't believe that Russia has the force levels or the capability to do what it wants to do in Ukraine. If it shows its hand too early, NATO will be thoroughly alert, and it'll find that the backlash in terms of European nations reinvesting in their defence, reinforcing NATO, and doing all the things that Russia doesn't need will happen. The other thing is, Alastair, Ukraine is not the same country it was 7 years ago, 7-8 years ago. It is much more keenly defended. It has better equipment, and the Russians will find they'll have a fight on their hands, even on the soil of Ukraine. So we're in a big game of bluff here. Putin is trying to get some big strategic advantages, splitting the transatlantic alliance, creating a buffer zone for himself, putting pressure on our allies in the Black Sea and the Baltic. He said, look, we don't want Finland and Sweden joining NATO. That's not going to happen. Well, hang on. When did Russia get a veto on what other countries want to do? He's trying to play for some big stakes here. He wants to be re-elected in 2024.
Yeah. Interestingly, within that, you mentioned NATO halfway through and then towards the end about other countries, and Russia does not have a veto. But NATO membership for Ukraine is, to all intents and purposes, what it's all about. currently, both sides say it's a red line. Are you saying, Chris, that you think that if Russia gets other goodies here and there, it may cease to be a red line for them?
Well, I think what we do have to offer President Putin is something to go home with. At the moment, he's stacked up all the money on the table, and the Russian people are going, well, OK, what do we get for that money? And so far, he hasn't shown anything. The brinkmanship hasn't worked. And if we're to dissuade him for doing something silly, and it would be silly because his economy would be tanked by the subsequent sanctions. As I said, he'd get involved in a bloody brawl in Ukraine itself. And the West will be thoroughly alerted. We're going to have to give him something that he can go home with and say, there we go. That is what a great power does when it actually starts sort of rolling up its sleeves and showing its muscles.
Yeah. In terms of concepts and doctrine, odd choice of words, but that's why I mentioned one of your three titles at the very beginning, Chris. In terms of concepts and doctrine, how different is what we're looking at now with cyber war and psychops and all of that stuff, as opposed to something like the Falklands, in which you served on the front line as a commander and I reported as a youngster?
Yeah, it's all these things we talk about are just enablers. War is about killing people. And I'm afraid, you kill people in the old way. It's with tanks, it's with warships, it's with missiles and aircraft. And at the end of the day, what we have to do is deter Russia by saying, look, we've got enough firepower to stop you if we have to. And we have. There's no question about that. And that is the basis for conventional deterrence and nuclear deterrence in NATO. What we're doing is saying, look, hands off Ukraine, because Ukraine wants to be a democracy. It doesn't really want to be part of the Soviet Union that you're trying to recreate. The trouble for Putin, of course, is if Ukraine is a successful state that has a good economy and it's got lots of oil and gas and wheat and a good arms trade, people in Russia are going to say, why can't we be like Ukraine? That's the real danger for Putin. And of course, the closer Ukraine gets to the West in terms of being a member of NATO, perhaps, in the distant future, or indeed a member of the EU, the less he likes it. I also think he has an agenda for driving across the bottom of Ukraine to capture Odessa at some stage. And if he can get away with it, he will. What's happening right now is we see one of these big exercises amongst the Russian forces every 12 to 18 months. They either happen against the Baltic states, up there, or down towards the Black Sea. Sometimes they go east to show the Chinese how good they are. Yeah. They're called the Vostok level of exercises. It's all designed to say, look, we might not be a great economy, but in terms of military power, in terms of muscle, we still count. We still want to be on the board of directors of world government. And that's what Putin's saying. He just wants some respect. Now, the key play for the West, of course, in strategic terms, is to suck Russia away from its relationship with China.
Yeah.
And if it can be drawn into a broader security arrangement that deals with these neuroses that Putin pushes out, then we're into something strategic that helps us both in relation to Russia and in relation to China as well. The problem is, Alastair, that I've been reading about Russian leaders since the revolution who are absolutely paranoid about not controlling the Baltic, the Black Sea, and the Arctic. And right now, they've got very little beachfront property in the Baltic and the Black Sea. They're trying to keep people out of the Arctic. And when you've got a country that's 10 time zones wide and a declining population from 220,000 probably down to 140,000 in 2060, you're liable to be a bit paranoid.
Absolutely fascinating stuff. And thank you so much, Admiral Chris, for finding time to join us tonight and share. Keep in touch. Love to talk to you again anytime. Thank you very much indeed.
Anytime. Admiral
Chris Parry there with his thoughts on Russia, Ukraine. I love that. So much good stuff in it, but also Russia doesn't have much beachfront at the moment. Professor Michael Clarke is another good friend of mine. He's former Director General of the Royal United Services Institute and across a brilliant career has held a series of very senior academic positions in defence studies. Michael, great to see you as always. How close in your view are Russia to engaging in a traditional classic war?
Well, I think war may be a bit of a big phrase for this, but some sort of military action is entirely plausible. I mean, I think Chris was saying that they don't have enough there at the moment to try to invade the whole of Ukraine, and we keep talking about an invasion of Ukraine. I think what we're really talking about is maybe some sort of military move. And one of the problems is for the Russians that they may be running out of time to do something. Remember, they've been building these forces up now for well over a month. You can't hold forces at readiness forever, for all sorts of technical reasons. The troops that they've got are in the middle, are passing the middle of their own deployment cycle. So in 3 or 4 weeks, they'll have to start being replaced and rotated with other troops coming in if those units stay there. And the ground at the moment is frozen, as we see from all of these pictures. It's only recently become frozen, which is good for armoured vehicles, but it will start to soften again, probably, round about the middle or end of March. We've also got the Beijing Winter Olympics, which run from I think it's the 5th of February to the 20th, and the Chinese certainly won't want Russian activity, some sort of military move during the Winter Olympics. Now, that won't necessarily stop the Russians, but it will certainly give them pause for thought. So if I was in Putin's position, I would be saying to myself, I've either got to go military or go home quite soon.
Yeah.
There is not that much time in which I can make this count, which is why we're in a dangerous position now. And Putin himself, whenever he's faced with a dilemma, he has a lot of previous on this. He always goes for the risky option.
Yeah,
almost
absolutely.
Always.
Yeah,
and that's the danger. That's the issue that we're in.
Chris was saying he studied Russian history, and I know for a fact, because we've talked about it, that you have as well. And you have a brilliant grasp of why the First World War started, not what happened in it, but why it started.
Yeah.
Could Putin find himself in a position with the generals behind him and the oligarchs over there where he can't get out of something that he started?
Yeah, it's a very astute point, Alastair, because everyone talks about Putin's decision-making, but remember, we're not just dealing with him. The fact is we've got the FSB behind him, the GRU, military intelligence, this whole group of oligarchs and the Russian military who are extremely conservative, and they are mainly committed to the Novorussia idea, the new Russia, which is a bit like the old imperial Russia of the 18th century. So it isn't just Putin, it is a fairly strong elite of military intelligence and oligarchs who do have these sorts of ambitions. And Putin himself, he shares those ambitions, but of course he's the person who's got to take responsibility for pressing a button or not pressing a button, giving the go-ahead or not giving the go-ahead. But I think we ought to assume that he will be under some pressure himself. On the one hand, to show, as Chris Parry said, that he's got something out of this crisis.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, not to get Russia into another Afghanistan. I mean, they know that if they were to try to seize Mariupol, for instance, which is to the west of the Donbass, that's part of the way towards opening a land corridor to Crimea. Even that would be tough. I mean, you look at what exists in Mariupol. It's not exclusively Russian-speaking or Russian-sympathetic people, and it's quite a long way from a land corridor. And equally, I mean, there's a group of Russian speakers in Transnistria, which is in Moldova, a sort of an enclave of people who want unity with Russia, and there are Russian forces there. They're not too far from Odessa.
Yeah.
But if they went eastwards to try to grab Odessa, which is a very important port, third biggest city in Ukraine, even that would pull the Russians into some sort of occupation status, which would be very difficult. So they've given themselves the options of doing all of these things.
Gotcha.
They've got security people there, they've got intelligence people there, they've got blood supplies there for casualties. He's given himself the options to do lots of different things. I think that Putin and the oligarchs don't yet know themselves what they really intend.
Let me pick you up particularly on that. You mentioned it in the last bit about the intelligence people and spooks that NATO warned us about today with cyber war and the rest of it. Is this the first full outing for a new concept of war? War by trade threats, by cyber attacks, even by mind games?
Yes, it's the first outing for the threat of this sort of war. And one of the things I've been chatting about and to various people and officials is that one of the indications we will get there is going to be some sort of military activity, some sort of military move, or even a limited one. One of the first indications we will get, apart from what our intelligence tells us from signals intelligence and satellite intelligence and so on, it'll be cyber attacks on us. If there is to be a military move, you can bet that there will be a series of cyber attacks on the West. on the retail, on the banking sector, on the health sector. Anything to actually distract the government, to actually use up the bandwidth of government and society to consider an external problem. And that's part of the playbook which the Russians have been developing. They've tried it out a few times in minor ways. If they really wanted to take a big move, and to be honest, even a small military incursion would be politically a big thing to do from where we are now, for all sorts of reasons I won't go into. But it would still be a big step to take. So if they were going to take a step that big, I'm pretty certain that it would be accompanied by cyber warfare, not just against Ukraine, but against NATO members and probably against us and the United States. They'll want to slow down our decision-making and confuse the people who have to clarify the picture and decide what to do.
Yeah. The Secretary of State for Defence, Ben Wallace, spoke of this and wrote about it in the Defence Review not that long ago. And the heads of heads of MI5 and, more importantly, MI6 and GCHQ have actually talked about it and got on telly to talk about it. Extraordinary times from when you and I first met, where they were all hushed up secret names written in green ink that we weren't even allowed to talk about. It's all out there. But here's my point, Michael. They've talked about it, but that was relatively recently, March, as you said. Are we up to speed enough already, sitting here January on the cusp of February 2022?
Well, we don't know. We think we are. I mean, Britain has got probably the best cyber defences in Europe. Whether we're as good as the United States or not, people disagree. They differ. I mean, the US is very bad in some respects because it's such a big, dislocated society. It's not as cohesive as we are in terms of government. But so we're pretty good on that. We think we're pretty good on offensive cyber, which is to say that if we are attacked, we can actually attack back. And the opposition knows that, and we've done a certain amount of that, and we now admit that we've done it. It used to be a secret, but it isn't anymore. We're quite good at offensive cyber, but we've never been attacked in a really military campaign. What the cyber people will tell you is they don't worry about hackers, sort of spotty kids in their bedrooms trying to break into the MOD. That's a nuisance, but it's only a nuisance. And we're not really worried about criminals. Because they're a nuisance too, but we deal with them differently. The real threat, the cyber threat, is state-based.
Yes. And
it's where states get onto it. And the states we know, the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians are not bad, they try it. But it's basically the Russians, the Chinese, and the North Koreans are the ones who've already caused us a lot of trouble. And of those three, the Russians have caused us the most trouble. Yeah. And we know what they do. But they've never employed it as part of a big military campaign. And this is the first time that it might happen if we get to the point of this becoming a military campaign.
Absolutely fascinating, Mike. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for your knowledge, experience and long-standing friendship. Always good to see you. Thank you very much indeed.
Always good, Alastair. Thank you.
The great Professor Michael Clarke, always balanced, calm, but goodness me, there was some dramatic stuff in those observations from him. But as I say, delivered calmly and always with balance. Now, to say the planned rise in national insurance is in play is to rather understate it. The reasons are rich and varied. It was originally unveiled in Rishi Sunak's budget last year and plans a 1.25% rise for workers and employers to raise around £12 billion for the NHS initially, and eventually, and I underline the word eventually, for social care. But events, dear boy, as Macmillan said, have intervened. From the economic point of view, it's argued that it's not needed. To the purely political perspective, that dropping it might just help a Prime Minister who's in a bit of a corner. Both are there in force. Now, Sir John Redwood says the Tories simply shouldn't be raising taxes in any way. Better than expected economic growth and lower than expected government borrowing gives the Chancellor scope to help the NHS without increasing national insurance. Robert Halfon, the Conservative chairman of the Education Select Committee, is against it too, because it would hit poor people worst. He favours a windfall tax on business, a rise in capital gains tax, or a diversion of some of the savings from cutting overseas aid. The real point here is that those two, John and Robert, come from different and distant wings of the Tory party. Redwood, the traditional Thatcherite right, Halfon from what they call the blue-collar Tory wing of the party. Well, despite Number 10 and other ministers confirming today it will definitely happen, others are less sure. Joining me now is former Tory MP Angela Knight, but much more important, a person who chaired the Office of Tax Simplification and is also, we've spoken to her many, many times recently, the ex-Chief Executive of Energy UK. But that doesn't matter quite so much this evening, but it may do if I suddenly get a message on something else happening. Angela, great to see you as always. Most are agreed that the NHS is financially strapped. Is this the best way to raise money to help it through and cut those waiting lists?
There is no good way to raise money, because whichever way you do it, somebody is going to be taxed. And actually, whilst I take all the points that you've said and that you've conveyed from others, as all of them being absolutely correct, the reality is either we raise money or and it goes to the NHS and then on to social care, or we don't. So I think that, splitting down the decisions has to be made. Are you up for it or you're not up for it? That's one, because whatever may be happening elsewhere in respect of tax returns, economy, debt, or whatever, there'll always be sort of tenfold, other important things to do with that money now. So the first question is, is the government going to do it? And somebody has got to do it, it being more money to the health service right now and then reform social care. So
okay,
the second question...
Let me hang on, before you come to the second one, let me come in on that particularly, because you addressed directly the Redwood thesis, that if there is a need for money, tax is always hurt. Redwood says we don't need it because growth has been higher than the Office of Budget Responsibility predicted, and the government has borrowed a lot less. So you can still do it without having to raise taxes, hurrah. Is he right?
Well, I suspect that he is. You can say, OK, don't do anything about the debt at the moment. Take some of that money that you weren't expecting to get and spend it in this direction. There'll be others who say, but hang on, there's some more things which are going to be much harder for individuals and families. For example, energy costs, use it for that. There is always a list. And so you're right. It could be that governments say, OK, on this particular issue, which is called national insurance, social care, the health service, we're not going to do this year, we're not going to make that raise. And I emphasize that this year, because the reality is that we have to do this reform of social care. So as people are getting older, dare I say it, like you and me, there is what we think we paid for there for us when we need it. You can't just say, this is the decision today in February, in March, in April, or whatever it is, 2022. You've got to get something in for the long term.
Yeah.
Does that mean that you say, we'll move funding from this year to another year because we've got an exceptional circumstance and we're going to use that exceptional circumstance in one direction, i.e. not levy an increase in tax, but spend that more money. But by the way, you've got to pay for whatever else that may come through, serendipity, which doesn't happen at the moment, or horrific, which does. You can do that, but you still got to set that plan. And if you don't have that plan, you don't bake it in, then we'll just muddle through as we've been doing year after year after year, particularly on social care.
OK, on the pure politics of it, and you're very good at that as well as the economics, on the pure politics of it, if you were Prime Minister or Chancellor of the Exchequer, and you know the Tory party very well, having been a Tory MP, how worried would you be that the Redwood wing of the party and the Halfon wing of the party are both opposed to what you plan to do?
Very is the answer. And I'd be very worried, and I would reflect upon what I'd done about selling or not selling the proposition that I'm putting forward. Because I'm just going to do national insurance, then I'm going to do income tax. Sorry, I'm going to take a little bit of time to do it, but I will do it as quick as I can. If I pick up national insurance, first of all, something like about 6.5 million of the workforce don't pay it. And those who are over the statutory retirement age and who are arguably going to be paying more for it right now, they don't pay national insurance either. And because national insurance is capped, it kind of gets spread a little bit better across the workforce. So you can see why national insurance is a decent proposition, and particularly because it brings in businesses as well.
Yeah.
If I shift it to income tax, which some say income tax is fairer, well, if you look at the numbers there, it's something like 25% of all income tax is paid by 1% of the adult population. And then, when you get to about 25% of the adult population, well, they're paying about 80% of all income tax. So there's kind of income tax is paid by the few for the many. You're going to tell me, well, which one's fairer? And the answer is both are pretty difficult. There is no easy answer to this.
Angela,
if I was going to say
last point, quick one.
Then I would have sold it better in the first instance. Who didn't pay it and why some of it gets spread a little bit more broadly than income tax does.
It was the conclusion of my first conversation about Liz Truss and her jet and flying to Australia. Never forget to tell people what you're up to and why you're up to. Angela, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for breaking into your Friday evening to be with us. Thank you very much. Angela Knight there. Now, it's meant to be a children's book, but Harry Potter now comes with a trigger warning, and that's for university students at Chester, no less. It's because Chester University are worried that some will take offence to difficult themes the story franchise could bring up, or perhaps the author herself could bring up. The trigger warning tells students, and I quote, "Although we are studying a selection of young adult texts on this module, the nature of the theories that we apply to them can lead to some difficult conversations about gender, race, sexuality, class and identity. These topics will be treated objectively, critically and most crucially with respect. If anyone has any issues with the content, please get in touch with the module leader to make them aware." The book's author, J.K. Rowling, has come under huge criticism, of course, and even been ostracised by some groups for her views on sex, gender and identity. Joining me now to discuss this is my very good friend, Andrew Doyle. I am spitting blood. Not least because you and I had what we thought at the time was an amusing exchange when there was a health warning put on George Orwell's brilliant 1984, and both came to the conclusion, irony is irony dead. Now, because of JK.
Well, I mean, one suspects that this is really a kind of punishment towards her because they don't like her views. But just to, in fairness...
But it's a university.
Right, well, quite. Well, this is an ongoing problem, isn't it? The infantilism of adults who are, you know, these are adults, these aren't children. And anyway, we're dealing with a children's book that doesn't require warning when infants pick it up. So this is very, very bizarre. Chester claim, by the way, that this is a formulation that they use on all reading lists. They've said that now. That's not true. And the Times pointed out that it was only on this particular reading list. So it's a bit suspicious. But I mean, the real problem with any kind of trigger warning, I mean, as you say, on 1984 or indeed on this book or any book when it comes to you're dealing with adults, is that it kind of suggests there's something to be suspicious about a book. In other words, a book is a potential source of harm. It's like a little grenade that might go off and that you need protection from it. And you might say, well, you know, you're just trying to signal to people who have been through trauma that it won't be reignited. But everything we know about cognitive behavioural therapy tells us that actually that's the worst thing you can do with people who suffer from trauma. And so, you know, it's just...
But even, and I will be brutal, whether it gets me thumped or not, actually on this one I don't care. That's a minority, and my heart is with them, and we need to find ways. I was at Bristol University, and a tiny minority took their own lives at Clifton Suspension Bridge every year at the time of finals. These things happen. Universities are about challenging the likes of you and me. We both thoroughly enjoyed it. We heard stuff we profoundly disagreed with. We heard stuff where we thought, oh, that's quite an interesting idea. You don't put cotton wool round it. You throw it out there, whether it's Mein Kampf or Das Kapital.
Absolutely right. I mean, and if you are disturbed by violence and those kind of, and torture and whatever else you might see in 1984 or Harry Potter, you know, three-headed dogs or whatever, then I wouldn't study literature. You know, just don't do that. It would be like someone who can't stand the sight of blood specialising in heart surgery. It doesn't make any sense at all. You just avoid it yourself, and you don't need some authority figures telling you.
And if you don't like wars in Ukraine, probably don't do chemistry because that's how gunpowder is made.
Right. I mean,
for God's sake.
This is fairly straightforward stuff. I mean, there are now trigger warnings and all. There's a warning actually at UCL on an archaeology module which warns that people might see distressing things such as bodies and bones. Well, I would expect you would see some bones when it comes to an archaeology course. You know, so we don't need these sort. It's very infantilizing. It's treating adults as children, and it's buying into this idea that words are harmful and they're not.
Final point, and literally 20 seconds I've just said in my ear. Is anyone who has any power, I mean, we can argue and shout about it as mates and GB News workers. Anyone going to do anything about it?
Well, I would like to think that they would, but again and again we keep finding that these figures of authority just go along with this. And the reason they go along with it is people complain so much and get so angry about it. We need more people in those kind of positions in academia to say, this is nonsense, we're not doing this on our courses.
Thank you for finding time. You're a busy man as always. See you very soon, Andrew. That's it from both of us. Mark Dolan is up next, but from me, I'll be back at 12 o'clock tomorrow and on Sunday. What a busy chap I am. Hope you've enjoyed it. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Hello, we've got some stormy weather to come across the northern half of the UK this weekend. A very windy picture through Saturday. Some spells of rain to come at times too, with the quietest of the weather towards the south. That's because this area of high pressure is sliding away. We've got an area of low pressure been named Storm Malik by the Danish Met Service, giving some very strong winds. But yet another system then piling in for Sunday. A lot of cloud in the sky overnight tonight. Temperatures, if anything, rising a little bit through the night with all that cloud around. But it's across western Scotland where we'll see the rain piling in, turning heavy and persistent. We could see up to 80 millimetres of rain here with some strengthening winds towards the end of the night. But look at our temperatures, 7 to 10 degrees Celsius. So those winds will be very strong through the morning, widely 50 to 60 mile an hour gusts, potentially 70 to 80 miles an hour. The Met Office have issued an amber warning for northeastern parts of Scotland, where we could see some damaging gusts of wind to come through the day. And it remains windy through much of the day. Even further south, the winds will start to pick up, staying quite cloudy across the far south of the UK, but elsewhere brightening skies, a few showers pushing their way through, and cooler weather with the blustery conditions. Now, the worst of the winds will ease through Saturday evening, pulling out into the North Sea. With that ridge of high pressure building in, then we'll see the skies clearing, the winds easing down, and a touch of frost is likely as we start the day on Sunday. Temperatures in rural spots getting close to freezing. But you can already see out towards the west this next system starting to push its way in. That'll start to increase the cloud across the sky, so a hazy sunny start, but quickly turning quite cloudy. And I think as we get into the afternoon on Sunday, we will see that wet weather pushing in across Scotland. Notice it bumping into the colder air, could give some hill snow as well. And later on, we will see those winds turn very strong once again, where warnings remain in place for Sunday. We'll keep you updated with the latest. Bye-bye.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching